Newsmakers this week. We're joined by Congressman Adam Schiff of California. He's the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, also serves on the House Select Committee on Benghazi. And to help with our questions in our studio, we're joined by Niall Stanage, associate editor of the Hill newspaper, and Ryan Lucas, intelligence reporter with CQ Roll Call. And Ryan Lucas has the first question.
Congressman Schiff, thank you for talking to us today. I wanted to start off with the announcement from the White House that it was essentially scrapping the train and equip program for Syrian rebels. Instead of training and equipping them, they are going to essentially provide information to vetted insurgent leaders and then small packages of equipment to then send back with them so that they can kind of be force enhancers in Syria. Is this plan, the way that the White House outlined it, is this something that is, you think, going to be more effective than the original program that the White House came out with?
Yes, I mean, it would be hard to imagine how it could be less effective given the very small number of people who were successfully trained and equipped under that DoD effort. So I do think it will be more successful. I think it will be far more efficient and effective to work with forces that are already on the ground, that are already demonstrating a will to fight. So I think this is a change that's necessitated by the failure of the DoD program, but also makes a lot more sense.
Congressman, from the beginning of this debate on how to aid Syrian rebels here, you've expressed some concern about how to vet the individuals who are receiving our aid. So as we go from recruiting and training to what's being called equip and enable, does it make the vetting process any easier?
Well, it doesn't make it any easier, but we do have relationships with some of the commanders of these units. We can witness what they're doing on the ground, and we have been witnessing what they're doing on the ground. So, I think we have both a good sense of their fighting capability, and the administration has been making an effort in combination with the intelligence community to identify, are these moderate, are they radical, are they somewhere in between, and using those factors, I think, give us some good guidance about who we should back.
Congressman, the White House said today that essentially they were not going to drop the requirement that rebels state that they will only fight the Islamic State and that they won't go after the Assad regime as well. Can this program succeed if they don't drop that requirement?
Well, I think ultimately that's going to cause a real problem. I think initially we certainly can provide support to those groups that are fighting ISIS, that are on the front lines with ISIS, but this is not a static battlefield. It is very dynamic, and those battle lines change, and a group we're supporting today because they're fighting against ISIS, if they're successful in the fight against ISIS and it brings them then into conflict with regime forces, they're going to be up against regime forces. So I think that line is going to be very difficult to maintain, and that's been a problem all along. We also have the issue of whether the fighters understand that we'll be there to support them if they come under bombardment by the regime or now by the Russians. So it's a very difficult battle space, and I'm not sure that distinction is going to be easy to maintain.
Congressman, if I may just shift gears a little bit here. Obviously, you have been a critic of the Benghazi committee. At the same time, Capitol Hill has been roiled this week by the whole debate over the speakership. Majority Leader McCarthy made some controversial remarks about the Benghazi committee. Then he dropped his bid a few days later. Obviously, you're a member of the other party, but how do you think those two things were related?
Well, I think that what Representative McCarthy said was what everybody had long since recognized, and that is that this committee, whatever its genesis, whatever its original purpose might have been, and many of us were skeptical even from the beginning, has become a committee interested in only one thing, and that is trying to inflict damage on Secretary Clinton. If you look at the press releases put out by the committee, they're disproportionately about Secretary Clinton. If you look at the obsessive focus of the committee's work and its public statements, it's essentially all about Secretary Clinton. So we've lost sight of what was supposed to be the object, and that is discovering something new about that tragic night in Benghazi. And I feel terrible for the families, but also for the American taxpayers that have supported this effort that has produced so little over all this period of time. In terms of the connection between those remarks and his dropping out of the speakership, I'm sure those remarks Some questions among GOP members about whether he was the best spokesperson for their conference. The Speaker is, among many other things, the most public face of the GOP in the House. And I think probably some of their members felt that if he was going to be so transparent about their object with the Benghazi Select Committee, maybe he might give up the goods on some of their other efforts, or at least be less politic in how he described them. So it probably was a factor, but I imagine the overriding factor was the challenge of getting that Freedom Party, that Tea Party caucus, to support him or anybody else on the House floor when it actually comes to a vote for Speaker.
Let me just, if I may, get more into your view that the committee is very politicized and that you believe it should be disbanded. Just in the past few days, for example, the committee's work led to a revelation that Michael Isikoff of Yahoo News, a well-respected reporter, characterized this way. Hillary Clinton used her private email account to pass along the identity of one of the CIA's top Libyan intelligence sources, raising new questions about her handling of classified information. Is that not the kind of thing that the public has a legitimate interest in finding out about?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't put much trust in anything that's leaked out of our committee, because historically, when there have been leaks from the committee, they've been proved to be inaccurate. I don't want to comment on the merits of this particular allegation. But there are many things the public may have an interest in that are well beyond the scope of what this taxpayer-funded committee was established to do. The question is, does the work of the committee shed light on the events in Benghazi? Is it going to tell us more about how these 4 Americans lost their lives, or what steps we could take to better protect our consulate and our facilities? And the answer is, for 7 work and $4.5 million, we're no closer to really producing anything new than when we started. And at a certain point, you've got to say enough is enough. That doesn't mean that there aren't legitimate issues over whether certain emails should have been classified. Many of them are being classified now after the fact, and it's hard to quarrel with the Secretary when they weren't classified at the time. Those are legitimate questions, and indeed the Justice Department is looking into the proper classification, and the Intel Committee is looking into the same thing. But in terms of attacking the Secretary over this, that's the job of the Republican National Committee. That's not the job of a taxpayer-funded committee. The Democratic Party committee, they can go after Jeb Bush for his use of a private email server as governor of Florida, and his use of it for official business. That is the work of the parties. But I would no more advocate that Democrats create a taxpayer-funded committee to look into Jeb Bush than I think that the Republicans are justified in doing the same with Secretary Clinton.
Congressman, I should note that we're recording this on a Friday afternoon for our viewers. And as of right now, House Republicans are working on a concerted effort to recruit Ways and Means Chairman Paul Ryan to run for the Speaker spot. I wonder, do you think that Democrats could find a way to work with Paul Ryan, at least better than they did with Speaker Boehner, if he becomes the next Speaker?
I certainly think we could find ways to work with Paul Ryan. I like Paul very much. I think he's a bright guy. He's a very personable guy. I don't find him to be the kind of striking ideologue that you find that characterizes the Tea Party or Freedom Caucus. So he's absolutely someone that Democrats can work with. Of course, that may be the most serious indictment against him. And indeed, I think Speaker Boehner was someone we could have worked with had he been given the latitude by his conference to do so. The challenge for the GOP is that you've got this rump group of Tea Party members, but then you've got a broader group of more mainstream Republicans who run in fear of having a Tea Party primary. And when you add those two groups together, it often constitutes a majority of the Republican conference. That is, the Tea Party and those that are afraid of a Tea Party primary challenge. And Paul Ryan, if he becomes Speaker, is going to have exactly that same dynamic to work with. So, yes, he's someone we can work with. So, frankly, was Speaker Boehner, but they have this internal problem that they need to overcome. And, I will say this also. I take no satisfaction in the turmoil going through the GOP conference right now. I mean, I'm certainly glad it's them and not us having the turmoil, but at the same time, they're the governing party. We need them to be able to be functional. We need them to be able to govern. We need someone, frankly, we can work with. We need a speaker who can deliver his conference, or at least enough of them to get to yes And for a long time, we just have...
Congressman, I want to turn back abroad again, and specifically to Syria and Russia's intervention there. You mentioned that the U.S. needs to continue its support for rebels that it backs on the ground. But Russia's intervention has significantly altered the dynamic on the ground and of the conflict more generally. U.S. officials have said that they aren't going to have their campaign against the Islamic State changed at all by the Russian campaign, but already there are reports that planes have, had to alter their flight plans. And there's also the broader problem of U.S.-backed rebels being targeted by Russian strikes. How should the U.S. respond to this? Should the U.S. up their support for the rebels? Should they vow that they will protect rebels from Russian strikes? This puts the administration in a bit of a tight spot.
Well, it does put the administration in a difficult challenge. Absolutely. Look, I think that we should push back harder against the Russians than we have, and I've been advocating this for some time. I think we should have pushed back harder in Ukraine and still should. I think we should provide defensive arms to Ukraine to defend against these Russian vacationers, these so-called little green men. But I also think that the battle space in Syria is now changing, and we're going to have to change strategy along with it. And so some of the things that have been considered by the administration, I think they're going to have to renew consideration over, and that might be in the shape of some kind of a safety or no-fly or secure zone. It may also be, and this was the suggestion of General Petraeus, establishing a policy where we'll no longer permit Bashar al-Assad to drop barrel bombs on his own people. That, I think, would enjoy the support of the vast Sunni population in Syria. It certainly would be consistent with our stand for human rights. And undoubtedly, there are both internal legal issues to overcome with that in terms of the outdated AUMF that we have, as well as international law considerations. But I think that we ought to open our eyes again to some of the other possibilities and reassess where we are right now and how things have changed given the Russian military involvement. The one last thing I would say on this, though, is I think the President is exactly right when he says that Putin is making a mistake by jumping into this thing with both feet, for two reasons. First, it's going to prolong the war. It's going to prolong the agony for the Syrian people. It's going to prolong the refugee crisis for the rest of the world and for those people going through the trauma of being refugees. I also think that Russia is going to find, just as we have and just as others have, there are real limits to what you can accomplish through the air. So they're buying a big piece of that. I think they will regret that, but that doesn't change the fact that it also must cause us to reassess the battlefield and what response we're going to make.
One could certainly make the argument that the Russians have a more effective fighting force on the ground with which to cooperate. Iranian-backed militias, you have Hezbollah on the ground, Syrian military forces themselves. This has been a problem for the U.S. The Kurds have emerged, obviously, as somebody that they can work with. But a reliable partner on the ground is kind of part of the struggle that the administration has had. Specifically, should the U.S. look into providing surface-to-air missiles to rebel groups to try to push back against what the Russians are doing?
I don't want to see us provide man-pads to the opposition that could be later used to down civilian airliners. We've seen, unfortunately, all too often that weapons that are provided to moderate rebels or people we might support, whether it's in Iraq or in Syria, can easily end up in the wrong hands. And it could be an utter nightmare if man-pads got in the wrong hands and they started to use them against civilian aircraft. So that's not something that I think we ought to entertain. I think there are other ways that we can raise the pressure on the regime as well as raise the pressure on Russia that don't involve providing those kind of lethal weapons that can be used against civilian craft.
And Congressman, before we leave Russia for a second, I want to ask, was the U.S. intelligence community caught flat-footed about the speed and the force level with which Russia went into Syria? And if so, is that something that the Intelligence Committee is looking into?
Well, we certainly, had evidence and I think could see the Russian buildup. that the Russians would decide to use this buildup to go after the moderate opposition, that they would embark on as aggressive an air campaign and perhaps a ground campaign. That, I think, is a surprise. Months ago, I think we would have expected the Russians to perhaps increase their material support for the regime as we saw the regime weaken and weaken and weaken. But I don't think we expected Russia to mount this kind of a military operation to prop up the regime. We're going to look at this. I don't think that just because something unexpected happens, that it necessarily means you've had an intelligence failure. Putin keeps a very small circle of decision makers. This may have been a decision that Putin himself made quite last minute to take this change in direction. We had hoped, obviously, that as the regime weakened, the decision Putin would take would be to work with us, work with other nations on figuring out what the transition ought to be and who ought to be part of the coalition that would follow. Instead, the Russians have decided to double down on the regime in a big way. It's a provocative and dangerous move, ultimately a counterproductive move, but I'm not sure that we can say this is something that we should have predicted.
Congressman, circling back to the Benghazi issue, if I may, your party colleague, Congressman Grayson of Florida, filed an ethics complaint against Representative McCarthy, as you know, the accusation being that Mr. McCarthy was using taxpayer dollars to make political attacks upon Hillary Clinton. It seems like you share his underlying view, but do you think it was the right thing to do to file an ethics complaint?
I haven't read the ethics complaint. Certainly if there is a deliberate effort to abuse taxpayer dollars, if there's coordination between the committee and the Republican National Committee, there may be a very good case to be made that this is also a violation of law and ethics. Again, I haven't read the ethics complaint, so it's hard for me to talk about any specific allegations there. I certainly think ethics violation, it is a terrible abuse of taxpayer dollars, and at this point is no longer serving a valid purpose and ought to be disbanded.
And just also to get back to the speakership issue, this is a somewhat hypothetical question, but bear with me. It seems at least plausible that we may be in a situation where no Republican nominee can get the 218 votes on the House floor that is required for a speaker. It would seem unlikely in that scenario that Nancy Pelosi could do so either. What happens in that situation? How do we get to a point where the substantive issues that you alluded to earlier can be addressed?
Well, I think as Speaker Boehner has said, he is willing to stay on as long as it takes to find his successor. I have to think the Speaker, although not enjoying what's going on in his conference right now, must be having some well-placed I told you so's about the difficulty in running the conference. This is not really about Speaker Boehner or any failings on Speaker Boehner's part so much as it is just a structural problem within the GOP, within the party at large, but in particular within the Republican conference. I happen to think they'll arrive on someone. As the days go by, as their dysfunction is showcased before the American people, there are going to be increasing pressures on the Republicans to get their act together. And that pressure, I think, will be most significant on that Freedom Caucus, those Tea Party members. So I think you will see a new speaker chosen that will be able to get enough votes on the floor, but not until sufficient pressure is brought to bear on that rebel faction.
Congressman, I want to turn briefly to cybersecurity and the massive hack on the Office of Personnel Management specifically. Do you have faith in the OPM to continue to process old security clearance information for the federal government? There is talk in Congress about shifting that responsibility elsewhere. Is this something that you could get behind, and where exactly should it be put?
It's a good question. I know there have been a number of members looking into shifting that responsibility elsewhere. Certainly, OPM didn't demonstrate the kind of alacrity they needed to beef up cybersecurity in advance of these attacks or in the wake of these attacks. I think they have adopted a new management strategy, and I'm willing to give it time to see whether they can get their act together. But I have to say, when this story broke, when this hack was revealed, and we were briefed in the intelligence community by OPM, It was one of the least impressive briefings I've ever had. And in fact, I don't even feel that the briefers were fully candid with us, which is not an allegation. I'm easy. So I start out with deep skepticism about OPM. Certainly his track record is very poor, but I'm willing to give the new management an effort to see if they can demonstrate success.
Congressman, yet another issue, the issue of gun control, has of course become prominent for rather tragic reasons in the past couple of weeks. And on that point, on your Twitter account, you addressed those who are rallying on social media around the Do Something hashtag, and you tweeted, "I hear you, I agree with you, words are not enough, action needed on background checks, mental health and gun violence." Obviously many people would agree that words are not enough on that issue, but being realistic about Congress and about Capitol Hill, how much action can we reasonably expect on that topic?
Well, you know, unfortunately, if you're a betting person and you bet against Congress, you almost always win. The issue of gun safety, you would invariably win. But I'm not willing to give up trying. I just can't accept that we're going to have to go through this national tragedy each and every month or week. We had another campus shooting just within the last 24 hours. We can't accept this. And it's a terrible indictment of our current Congress that something that is so broadly desired by the American people, like universal background checks, that enjoys not only vast majorities of the general public, but even majorities of the NRA, that we still can't seem to accomplish that. So, you know, I think we need to stay at it, and we need to fight this until we get it done. People around the country need to make their voices heard. And they need to drown out those people that are standing in the way of very common sense reforms that would help improve the safety of the community. You know, I do think that probably one area that is more essential than others, just given often the common denominator in a lot of these shootings, and that is too ready access to guns by people with serious mental health problems. We have to find a way of addressing that. In California, we took a significant step forward just recently by enacting a new law that essentially allows family members and law enforcement to work together to get a restraining order against a mentally ill member of the family who seeks access to firearms. I think that is a vitally important step, and I would love to see the rest of the country follow suit.
Congressman, do you think the Democratic candidates for president are doing enough to focus on these issues and these priorities that you're talking about, specifically when it comes to gun control?
Well, I think Secretary Clinton has just recently outlined a very aggressive platform and support for a variety of gun safety legislation, as well as actions she would take using the executive power of the president. One of the items that Secretary Clinton mentioned, a bill that I've been carrying for a number of years, and we may again reintroduce, and that is a bill to end the unique immunity from liability that the gun industry enjoys. We passed something in Congress many years ago called PLACA, which is the acronym, but essentially it gives the gun industry a form of immunity even from negligence, the negligent sale to people who go on to use weapons to commit violent crime. They have an immunity no other industry has. And we ought to end that unique safe harbor for the gun industry and take a great many other steps as well. And I think the Secretary certainly has been very vocal on this.
We have about a minute or two left here in our time with you, Congressman. So just one or two more questions.
I will be very, very brief then. U.S. recently reached an agreement with China about not conducting economic cyber espionage against one another. The Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, has said that he's not optimistic that this is actually going to work, doesn't trust the Chinese, doesn't trust that the implementation and follow-through will necessarily be there. Do you think that this is going to be effective, or has the administration gone out on a limb with this?
Well, I think we've taken a first step when President Xi was here and acknowledged that use of cyber to commit economic espionage is something all nations ought to condemn. You know, that was a positive step. You know, frankly, though, China has been #1 culprit in terms of cyber theft for R&D. So President Xi and China would be very late in coming to the game. if they suddenly put an end to this kind of economic espionage. Nonetheless, acknowledging the rules of the road is a first step. There are some public reports of China making arrests. That is also a positive step. But ultimately, I agree with Director Clapper, and that is, I think it's necessary for the United States to initiate a series of escalating sanctions on Chinese companies that are making use of stolen American research and development. Now, the challenge is that China will reciprocate by sanctions against American companies, and American companies don't engage in this kind of economic espionage, but they'll come up with a ruse or some kind of an explanation for why they're going to do a tit for tat. We'll have to be prepared to suffer some economic reciprocity here, but until we embark on these steps, these graduated sanctions, if you will, I don't think we're really going to get China to alter its behavior at all.
Well, we'll have to end it right there. Congressman Adam Schiff, I want to thank you for being our newsmaker this week.
Thank you.